Sermon for today is a Jesus who welcomes outcasts in the 14th chapter of Luke, which we'll read in a minute. But before we do, I want to share with you a story. And the story is from this kid's book called The Curvy Tree. And I got to tell you just first, before I tell you the story, that I'm going to botch the story most likely because I'm a terrible parent, and I did that thing where you're kind of listening but not listening while the story is being read to you. So if you've read the Curvy Tree book, this is kind of the expanded and improved Dwayne version of it. The story is about a little girl named Mary. I actually don't even remember if that was her name. I think maybe it was just little girl, but we'll call her Mary. Anyway, Mary is from a poor family of mixed race parents, and she just kind of never really felt like she fit in her town. The kids at her school, they were far better off. They were into, all kinds of things like ballet and sports that she couldn't afford and didn't really like. What she really liked to do was to play with plants in the garden. So she was always dirty, has these big glasses, always felt like she was kind of on the outside, like different than everybody else, always on the outside looking in. And, so then what happened is that kids do what kids do, and they weren't really nice to her. They wouldn't include her. They'd make fun of her. And one day they hurt her feelings so bad that she goes running off into the fields. And she ran until she comes to this tree. She'd never seen the tree before, but she finds the tree and she sits down underneath it and puts her head in her hands and just starts sobbing. And at that moment, all of a sudden, the tree spoke. And the tree said, "It's okay, little one. It's okay. I know how you feel." He said, "Yeah, you see, this whole field, it used to be full of trees. Nice, beautiful, big, straight trees that they always made fun of me because of all my knots and curves because I was different. But one day some foresters came in and they cut down all of the straight trees, but they left me because I was all curvy. And the foresters, they used all the trees for lumber, but now it's just me, and I'm all alone. I'm crooked and useless." What this story taps into, I think, is this common feeling that I think is more common than we suspect, that in any human interaction, if you think about it, there's kind of a few things going on that we experience, whether it's time from when we're young and then on through adulthood. There's three things going on. One is how I see me, how I see myself. And then there's how I see you when I look at you. And then there's a third element of how you are seeing me, how I see you seeing me, those three different perspectives. And my guess is that more often than not, the way that we see ourselves is that we see ourselves as being very different than everyone else. And so what we often try to do is we adjust our persona, as it were, to adapt and to try to find more commonality with the other people that we are seeing, because when it comes down to it, we just want to belong. We want to be accepted. We want to be liked. We want to be loved. In the scenes and teachings of Jesus we're looking at today, it's really about belonging and how Jesus' goal and mission in coming to earth was to do something so that we might be welcomed into his wonderful family, so that we might belong as a special honored guest. So with that, let's go ahead and stand and read God's word for today. We're biting off another big chunk in Luke. We're going to do all of chapter 14. So put your seatbelt on. Here we go. Beginning in verse 1. One Sabbath, when he, that's Jesus, went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully, and behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus responded to the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. Then he took him and healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, "Which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath, they will not immediately pull him out?" And they could not reply to these things. Now he told a parable to those who were invited when he noticed how they chose the places of honor, saying to them, "When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, 'Give your place to this person.' And then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. He also said to the man who had invited him, "When you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just." When one of those who reclined at the table with him heard these things, he said to him, "Blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." But he said to him, "A man once gave a great banquet and invited many. And at the time for the banquet, he sent his servant to say to those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, I've bought a field and I must go out and see it. Please have me excused." And another said, "I've bought 5 yoke of oxen and I go to examine them. Please have me excused." Another said, "I've married a wife and therefore I cannot come." So the servant came and reported these things to his master. And then the master of the house became angry and said to his servant, "Go out quickly to the streets and the lanes of the city and bring in the poor and crippled and blind and lame." And the servant said, "Sir, what you commanded has been done, and there's still room." And the master said to the servant, "Go out to the highways and the hedges and compel people to come in, that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those men who were invited shall taste my banquet." Now great crowds accompanied him. He turned and said to them, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, and yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king going out to encounter another king in war will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. Therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use, either for the soil or the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Whew. All right. So here's how I want to go at this today. Sometimes I just kind of move by paragraph by paragraph down through the text. But I want to do today is take things on a little bit more thematically, because there's basically 3 components of this section of text, the whole chapter that we're dealing with, that gets referred to in one way or another. So the 3 things we'll look at is the feast, the invitation, and the cost. There's a feast, there's an invitation, and there's a cost involved. Those are 3 elements. And the big idea that I hope you kind of take home believing is that in and through Jesus, you belong. That you belong. I want you to know that so much this morning, that if you're here and you're sitting and say, you belong here. You belong in the house of God. You belong in his family with his people, that God wants you to know that you can belong. So let's get to this first point, the feast. This whole episode gets kicked off because Jesus gets invited to this dinner party as a ruler of the Pharisees' house. So it means this guy's got kind of a big deal in the city, one of the big religious leaders. And Jesus, he's the honored guest. Now, there's a bunch of people around the table there, and apparently a number of people outside in the courtyard around the table that are watching and listening, which was the custom in that day. And what happens is that pretty quickly Jesus figures out that he wasn't invited by this guy because, and his high-powered friends, because they really liked him. They invite Jesus because they're hoping to catch him and trap him, to sort of defraud him, or maybe even arrest them. So that's what verse 1 is saying when it says they were watching him carefully. They're trying to catch Jesus in a trap. Jesus is just kind of down. He never is really afraid of a fight, and so he obliges and does something he knows is going to upset them by healing this guy of dropsy. But So he heals them, and then before they can respond, he flips the tables and he traps them, asking them a question that either way they answer ends up making them look dumb. And so they just don't say anything. They're really quiet. Verse 6 says they couldn't reply to these things, so they're just quiet. And so then Jesus, he takes hold of that opportunity in their silence, and he launches into talking about dinners and wedding feasts, and it morphs into this discussion about the great heavenly banquet of God and who's invited to it and who gets to sit at that table. Now, we'll talk about the invitation, about who gets invited to the table, but before we do, I think it'd be fitting for us just for a few minutes today to talk about food and feast. We'll probably food and feast today for Super Bowl party. The Bible, it talks about heaven quite a bit throughout the Bible. It talks about how there's going to be houses there, there's streets, there's work, we have jobs, there's times of worship, and then there's also times of feasting. So sometimes people think about heaven, it's like, oh, well, it's just this unending worship service. So, it's not. There'll be great worship services, but that's only one of the things that happens. One of the other primary pictures of heaven is of feasts, of feasting. I believe that's because food is important. Food is important. I don't think that food is just a functional thing for our bodies in order to live, but it's also one of the key elements that God has given for us to connect with other people. That life isn't just about blood pumping through my veins, that life is about connection and connecting with other people in healthy relationship. There's something about a meal, isn't there? Eating a meal with others, that enables you to connect with them. Something about eating and drinking, especially if it's alcoholic. It's like social elixir, it helps you connect with people. Now, interestingly, the whole story of personal interaction, of relationship in the Bible, it begins in the very beginning, in the beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, with God giving the first man and woman instructions having to do with food. Some of the first things that they talk about right away. God shows them the garden, says you can eat of any fruit of any of these trees except this one. It's going to be poisonous for you. That one's no good. Stay away from that one. So the Bible kind of starts off as a restaurant, and God, gives the menu here. The man and the woman, they end up not listening to God, so they eat from the tree, and they get sick because of it, just like he said. So result is God kills the first animal, and vegetarianism dies. And then he makes clothes out of the animal for them, and says, now you're going to have to work hard to get food and learn how to kill animals like me. Just kidding, if you're vegetarian, it's totally cool, or vegan, or gluten-free, or whatever you eat, it's good. Adam, he works hard at making food. Him and his wife, they begin to populate the earth, but things turn sour after not too long. After a number of years, God calls a man named Abraham to leave his home and to follow God, and promises to take him to this land flowing with milk and honey. So here's the promise of food again. It takes a long time to get there. When he and his descendants, they're wandering across the desert. At one point, they get really hungry, so God just straight up rains food down from heaven called manna, and that becomes one of the great miracles of God in the pages of the Bible. People slowly learn to trust God, his provision, and one of the things that God asked them to do is he says, hey, once a year I want you to have this special feast. We'll call it this Passover, where they remember God's goodness and graciousness to them. When Jesus comes on the scene, right away you just see him eating and drinking with people all of the time. And so much so that the religious leaders of the day, the pastors of the day, they're like, dude, this guy's like a drunken and a glutton. All he ever does is eat and drink with people. Jesus' most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, is blessed are those who hunger and thirst, for they will be satisfied. And his most famous prayer, the Lord's Prayer, he says to pray to the Father, Lord, give us this day our daily bread. And he says things like, man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Jesus does all kinds of miracles. One time he takes a few loaves of bread and fish, and he magically multiplies it to feed 7,000 people, not including the women and children. Then shortly after does it again with another 5,000. And then after that time says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part of me. Everybody's kind of confused at that until right one night before he goes to die on the cross, he has one last meal with his disciples that ends up getting called the Last Supper, where Jesus says the bread is his perfect life that he's lived, and his blood is the new covenant in his blood to be shed on the cross. Jesus dies on the cross. He rises again, and what's one of the first things he does once he sees the disciples? They eat. They have a meal. And then he ascends to heaven so that they can start the church. And guess what happens after that? Is every time that the church gathers, they have a meal. They eat, they break bread and eat it to remember Jesus and what he did. And we still do that today. We've got bread and wine here at these tables this morning. Jesus promised to return one day, and he says that when he does that final purging of sickness and sorrow and suffering, when it's done away with, his people will get to enter this eternal garden city, and they will sit at a table at a fancy feast called the marriage supper of the Lamb. We'll drink new wine and marrow and have great marrow and great food. The Bible, see, it's just filled with talk about food, and especially of this future feast to come, the banquet of God, where all kinds of people get to sit at the table and eat and drink, enjoy sweet fellowship with God and with one another. Here's just a couple verses. Isaiah 25:6, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples, that's people of all different races and colors of skin, a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine. Revelation 19, let us rejoice and exult and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come. Blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. So when Jesus starts talking about eating and dinners, and he says wedding feast in verse 8, they know it's a reference to this great heavenly future banquet, which is why one of the guys pipes up in verse 15 and says, blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. The way that Jesus talks about this feast in our text, I think the feeling and the sentiment that's carried with it, that it instills, is it just kind of makes you, or it's supposed to make you to want to go there. I want to eat at this feast. I want to be there and enjoy all the benefits that it provides. So think of it this way. What's like the most expensive restaurant you've ever eaten at? Like, I mean, you think about it when you really threw down some bucks for a meal, you know. I mean, you remember that? Like what it was like? You can think of a place. Think of the decor of the restaurant, what the service was like, the food, how it tasted. I mean, just think like what are the or maybe it's not a restaurant. Just think of what's the happiest meal that you've ever had. Now, the food's a definite element, right? But what else do you remember? Who you ate it with? Who was there? The picture that Jesus and the Bible gives to us of this feast is one with the best food and the best people. Like, getting a ticket to this event, a reservation to this place, is better than one at any other restaurant. It's better than any ticket to any concert. It's one where you want to go to. You want to belong. You want to go. Can't help it. I mean, you're invited to this house, and much more than even just being invited. You're welcomed into the house as a family member. You have a regular seat at the table. So the first point really about the feast is kind of painting the backdrop that's behind our text for today, that life is about relationships, and one of the primary ways that we experience relationship and connect with one another is through food and drink, and in that we feel like we belong. So what Jesus invited the man with dropsy to, and he invited these religious leaders and the subsequent crowd really, is to look forward to this heavenly banquet and to see Jesus as the way in, the invitation in. That through Jesus, it's through him that we can belong and come to the table. Through Jesus, outsiders become insiders. Outcasts become honored guests. Jesus indicates that's how we should feel and think about him in the future. And then he moves on to address why we often don't feel like that and think like that. So let's transition and look at that in our next point, the invitation. Have anyone here ever met somebody famous, like celebrity? I had the opportunity once to meet the true and better Dwayne The Rock Johnson. It's It's pretty great. Got invited to his house in Florida. It's got this pool that goes right up to the edge. He's got his yacht there and everything, and it was amazing. I'm just kidding. That's what I imagine it would be like. I don't know. He's got weights everywhere. He's just working out all the time. I don't know. What Jesus points out in this story is that the invitation to God's table is better than an invitation to anyone's house. I mean, name the house you want to go to. It's better than that. But our problem is that we don't see that, and we often just care more about what other people think than the invitation to God's house. We don't care about what God thinks. We tend to want to impress other people and to get in good with them rather than getting in good with God and responding to his gracious invitation. First, Jesus says it all boils down to, it just boils down to pride. And so verse 11 says, everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. It was 1997 when I first recognized that God was calling me to be a preacher. I was 19 years old at the time, and I was pretty excited about that. And so I started imagining myself. I'd never preached before, but I just started imagining myself preaching, and the picture that I had in my head was of preaching to thousands and thousands of people, in stadiums. So I literally thought, well, I guess God's calling me to be the next Billy Graham, and that's what'll happen. But the only thing was, the only job I could get was being this youth pastor at this really small church here in San Diego of 5 kids, But I did my best with that, and then I took the kids to summer camp that summer, the youth group to summer camp, and there were a few hundred other kids there, and so I thought, oh man, here's my opportunity. So I went right up to the camp director guy, and I said, hey, I really think that next year you ought to have me as the speaker here. And I'll never forget what he said to me. He turned to me and he pointed a finger in my face and he said, Dwayne, don't you ever aspire to be anything? And then he walked away. And I was dumbfounded. I'm like, what? And I eventually got a chance to talk to him later about it. And he said, Dwayne, just be a humble servant. Be faithful to do what God asks you to do. Be faithful with the small things. And if God wants to bring them out, great, fine. But let him bring that about you instead of you trying to make that happen. Let God do what he wants to do in his time. And that's really stuck with me throughout the years of my life and ministry. And I think what Jesus is pushing on here is really that we have this heart desire sometimes to want to be, in a sinful way, recognized and noticed. We want glory for ourselves, which is why guys back then, they would always try to sit, right next to the honored guest at the table, the seat of honor, so people would look up to them and think that they are great. And instead, Jesus says to sit down, be humble. He said it first. So we're to be grateful for our invitation to the dinner, recognizing that we probably don't even deserve to be there. I mean, we deserve really to not have an invitation at all, to be cast out due to our sin, our faults, our failures. But when we're honest about that before God, about our need, when God sees our humility, it compels him. Then he sees us. Oh, that moves his heart when we humble ourselves before him. So how's that sit in your life? Are you aiming high to be recognized by people, or are you aiming low to be a humble servant? Are you trying to get others to notice you, or you just care about whether God sees you? Well, after that, Jesus switches things up. He basically says, okay, so we thought about it from that perspective. Now let's think about it from another perspective. Thought about it from this perspective of being the invited guest. Now think about it from the perspective of the one that's throwing the party and inviting others to come. Who do you invite when you throw a party? I mean, do you just invite the people that you're close to, that you always hang out with? Do you just invite people in your same socioeconomic status or race or whatever? I mean, This is a real thing, right? I mean, think about like people invite to weddings. Who are you going to send the wedding invitations out to? Thanksgiving. Who are you inviting to Thanksgiving? Super Bowl parties, church. Who do you invite? Jesus says, hey, just invite everyone. Yeah, it creates a big problem, but invite everybody. Especially those who are seemingly on the outside. The poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Each one of these people would have been put in a class that was considered less than. Some of those categories even labeled unclean. In the first century, a person's class would determine like who they could marry, what functions they could attend, where they could live, and with whom they were allowed to do business. Class determined everything. So Jesus, he's always in this project of trying to take outsiders and then to make them insiders. Trying to pull them, make them feel like they belong and they are welcome. And this is a huge goal of our church, to be a church on mission for our city, that people who are on the outside can come in on the inside and know that they belong in Christ. Sometimes when I tell people, man, you got to like reach out to others and bring some more people into your life. I'll hear things like, my life, and I get it, is so full, I just don't have room for any more people. I've already got too many friends to deal with now, and I just think we'll get rid of some friends and make room for some new ones. That's what Jesus kind of did. He'd like hold on to people for a bit and then send them out and release them, catch and release. You can look at the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind classes in a lot of ways. There's spiritual parallels for sure. I think, as we've been reading through Luke, we just kind of repeatedly see Luke highlighting how Jesus reached out to the marginalized, whether it was people of different races, tons of talk about Gentiles. Luke was a Gentile himself, an outsider race. The reaching out to women who were often shunned and hidden, sick people, poor people, the lowly of society. Jesus, he has love for all minorities and focuses attention on them, welcoming them in. So to be fair, I think Jesus in this chapter is hearkening to those same themes, but I thought you could also even look at these quite literally, thinking about the poor, and I thought it'd be fitting this morning to talk about our mercy ministry as a church. Some of you might not know it, but every Tuesday night here in the courtyard outside, we feed the homeless. Kevin and Laura Cheslakowski, their family who's still somewhat new to church, they've been here for just about a year, and they've just kind of jumped right in. They're pursuing membership, and Kevin's kind of taken point as an intern under Dave Chrisman, our city engagement director with Mercy Ministry. And I got a chance to talk with Kevin on the phone this week and be like, hey, just talk to me about how things are going with Mercy Ministry, some things you've been experiencing and learning. And said some pretty profound things, I thought. He's been thinking a lot about the untouchables, how Jesus touched the untouchable. There's a lot of the homeless people, and if we've got some homeless folk here this morning, we're so glad to have you. There's the reality is they're like, sometimes they're smelly and dirty, but they're always grateful. And almost every time after we feel, they'll go in for a hug and say thank you. And at first it just kind of weirded them out, but now just embracing that connection, realizing what that means and how it's building trust with these folk as they begin to open up their stories. One gal that's been coming, she's only 23 and just had her birthday. And so Kevin and Laura, they got her some clothes, and as a result, she's decided that she wants to get clean, so they're taking her to a rehab facility. Another girl's been experiencing a conversion with her, seeing her need for Jesus, opening herself to him. Some come on Sunday mornings, and the number of just people, guys, showing and admitting their need for help. This last Thanksgiving, threw a party, Thanksgiving for them, and next day, Laura sent me this email. I asked her husband if I could read it, so hopefully she's cool with that. But this is what she wrote. The very first thing I wanted to do when I woke up this morning was to say thank you. My heart was literally bursting last night when everything came together so beautifully for the Thanksgiving feast for our friends in the homeless community. Last night we had a little over 30 people attend the dinner, some new faces, some people who come every single week. Some of the things I heard people say besides, this is awesome, were this reminds me of home. This reminds me of my mom, this is so delicious. Wow. And there were endless thank yous. The feast was absolutely perfect. We had everything we needed and enough for people to even have the best part, the leftovers. My prayer for last night was that every person that came would feel and experience the love of Jesus. It was moving to me how many people from our church were there with amazing home-cooked food and desserts, with hearts willing to serve and genuinely connecting with people. I think about the sign in the Resolve parking lot that says, God's glory, the Jesus story, San Diego. That sums up last night. Recently, the verses brought me to the point of weeping where Matthew 25, 35, and 40, when Jesus said, for I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. In verse 40, he said, surely I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me. What an honor to serve Jesus. Thankful to our loving Father who allows us to be part of him and loving his precious people. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that so cool? How God is enabling us as a church to live out the things we read in the Bible. If you want to get involved in Mercy Ministry, they'd love to help you out. Love to have you help them out on Tuesday nights and encourage you in that. I want our homeless community to know that there's always a seat for them here. And I want us to be a people who welcome them into that seat, even if it's smelly and dirty. Let's get into the mess together with the mission that Jesus has called us to. When you have nothing to give, all you have to give back really is thanks, gratitude. And Jesus points out in the last part of the parable is that we're often very ungrateful, and we don't realize what a great gift it has been to have an invitation to the table. He talks about how we often make excuses. Instead of coming into God's house, one guy says, oh, yeah, I got to go take care of this field of mine. Another guy says, you need to go take care of my animals. Another one says he just needs to hang out with his wife. You're not going to believe this, but I still hear these exact same excuses all the time. Like, I'll say, oh, man, it's good to see you this Sunday, and be like, oh, yeah, I haven't been around. I've had some work on my house I needed to do, the field. I'll be like, oh, hey, yeah, we've missed you. Oh, yeah, we got a new cat, and she meows all the time, which disturbs the neighbors, so we really can't leave her alone, and so that's why we haven't been here. Oh, man, I feel like I haven't seen you two in a while. Oh, yeah, we've just, we're newly married, and, we've just been doing some traveling, just kind of laying low because we need to spend some time together. I still hear these excuses, like thousands of years later. They're still popular. Those are all real conversations I've had in the last 3 months. And if you're one of those people, I'm sorry, I'm not telling everybody your name, so you're free. One of our emeritus pastors, older gentleman now named Ron Burisma, he used to call it GBO, which stands for Got a Better Offer. That when it comes to Sundays in our culture, there's always a GBO, got a better offer. There's always something better going on. Time magazine, a lady named Nancy Gibbs wrote this article titled On the Seventh Day We Rested. Interesting what she says. Over time, Sunday has gone from a day when we could do very few things to the only day we can do just about anything we want. The U.S. is too diverse. Our lives too busy and our economy too global and our appetites too vast, so there's a whole day that could be spent working or playing or shopping. Isn't that true? I mean, sports, stores, none of it used to happen on Sundays. They used to all be closed. Now there's everything going on Sunday, fun day. For many, Sunday fun day now, and worshiping God in his house, here it's a dispensable option. And it's not how it's supposed to be, I got to tell you this morning. I mean, remembering the Sabbath and keeping it holy, it's actually the third of the 10 commandments, of the 10 commandments. And it's not just about some religious duty, like you got to go to church. It's about the spiritual rest that we find in God's house. It's tasting that foretaste of the future feast, tasting the goodness of God and experiencing rest for your soul. Look, I'm not trying to be mean today. I'm just trying to be real, honest, and practical. I mean, it's not like you can't ever miss a Sunday. I tell our staff, our paid staff, look, you can miss 4 Sundays a year, and please do. You need to go on vacation. Unless you're sick, though, you need to be here. And a lot of you're new Christians, and so you're new to what being a Christian likes, or you're new to maturing as a Christian, what Christian maturity looks like. I'm just trying to teach us that gathering regularly and worshiping together on Sundays it's meant to shape us. It's good for us. It's one of the things that I believe God has designed and woven within the fabric of who we are as human beings and the way that his universe works. Mike Cosper, he wrote this book, The Rhythms of Grace, how the church's worship tells the story of the gospel. And I thought I'd read to you this little section from it. He says, the weekly gathering shapes our ordinary life, and ordinary life shapes our experience of the gathering. Our burdens and guilt and joys and celebrations inevitably come with us. We gather not to escape these burdens and joys, but to bring them to a place where we acknowledge what is most true, most real, and most valuable. There, in the light of the gospel, all of these emotions and all the circumstances of our lives are revealed in their proper place, and God speaks a word of peace over them. So we hold them up as we celebrate and thank. We hold them up as we confess and lament. And in return, we hear the voice of God thundering from his word and his son, pouring out grace upon grace as we remember, recommit, and are sent again into the world. Oh, it's not so much that we have to go to church. Oh, it's that we need it. Our souls desperately need it. We need God. And in the gathering together, God invites us into his presence, and he does work. He heals us, and he shapes us, and he forms us, and enables us to be vessels at work in his city for his glory. It's a powerful and compelling offer of how being here regularly shapes us as people. So I have a challenge for you. Some of you probably don't know this. About half of our church comes about once or twice a month. I got a challenge. Just set yourself a goal, if you're one of those people, to come to church every day. I mean, not every day, every week. You can do that if you want. It'll be dark in here, and sometimes I do that. Walk around and pray for the seats. But come every Sunday for 3 months. I challenge you that. See what it does in you. See what it does in you, how it forms you. I bet you'll feel different. And you'll see what I mean, getting into that regular rhythm of God's grace. God, he wants his house to be filled. Man, I tell you, when this room is full, there's a different sense to it, whether it's Malcolm Gladwell's tipping point thing or something greater and more going on than that. There's a different energy. And that's what God wants. Jesus says in verse 23, compel people to come into my house that it may be filled. Jesus wants this place packed out. Need you to be here. It'll be great together. There's an energy that God does through us gathering together as his people. Through Jesus, we belong. We're given invitations to his house, to his table, even though we're all outcasts. It's wonderful privilege and joy. All right, move on to our last point, brief point, the cost. Last third of the chapter where Jesus emphasized how great of a privilege and blessing it is to be part of his family and welcomed into his house and his feast through being his disciples. First, you got to recognize this is hyperbole when he says, to hate everything and everyone, to hate all the members of your family. He doesn't mean literally to hate yourself and your spouse and your kids and your parents. In other places, he says the direct opposite. What Jesus is doing here, he's a great communicator. It's an attention getter. That perks, it grabs you, perks your ears. It makes you think. In comparison to relationship with God, any other relationship, it just doesn't even, it pales in comparison. If any one of those relationships, you had to choose one or the other, you choose God every time. You choose Jesus every time. I married my wife, in this May it'll be 17 years, and I remember telling her on that day, babe, I promise that you will always be second. You will always be number 2. First Jesus, then you, then our kids, then everyone else. She says it's a big decision. And so he provides a couple analogies that I think are quite encouraging. He doesn't He's not manipulating people to becoming his disciple, kind of like preying on some emotional moment. He says literally, slow down, take your time, count the cost. You might be here and you're just kind of interested, you're kind of checking things out. That's cool. Jesus is down with that. And you're not maybe ready to sign on the dotted line, that's okay. Take the Theo 101 membership class that starts next week and you can figure that out. Jesus said it's a good thing. You should count the cost. It says, foolish to start a house project that you can't finish. So here's my recent house project. I built triple bunk beds for my kids because we live in a 990 square foot house. And so before I went to Home Depot, I got online and I looked up how much all of the wood was going to cost. $56. So I told my wife, hey, this is how much it'll cost. She said, sweet. And so we went and did it and built the bunk beds. And now they work. They're sleeping in them. When you sit down and you count the cost following Jesus, it's worth giving up everything just to have him. Worth it every time. It always adds up. Jesus brings up another comparison saying you shouldn't start a fight that you can't win. There's been countless battles and wars lost because one army underestimated the strength of another. You sit down and look at life. It's a losing battle. You cannot win it on your own. But when you look at Jesus, you see that he's bigger and better than any opposition. And with him, you always win. You'll surely overcome. And then lastly, he brings up salt. The way they got most of the salt, where in Bible times where this is taking place, from the Dead Sea, and it would come in these crystals where actually the sodium chloride, the salt, is compacted with gypsum. And so what can happen is that if it's not cared for properly, the sodium chloride can leak out, and then all you have left is just gypsum crystals that is actually has no flavor, it's useless for anything, and it's thrown away. Jesus says, hey, without him, we're like gypsum. Salt that doesn't really have any salt in it. So the better option is to be his disciples. What we do with our lives then, it actually counts. It's very useful for eternity. There's a cost to following Jesus. It costs everything, but it's worth every penny. Jesus and the feast he offers us is worth it. Through Jesus, we've been outsiders who become insiders, and we're welcomed into the closest circle of his family, and it's worth it. Through Jesus, we truly belong. When we count the cost on the scales, the benefits don't even compare. Just like Jesus said a few chapters ago in Luke 9, whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. We've covered a lot today. This chapter kind of feels like a full feast a bit, doesn't it? I started out today telling you the story of the curvy tree. What happens in the end is that, when the girl finds the tree for the first time, she feels like somebody gets her and she belongs. And so she goes back to the village and tells all of the kids about this talking tree. And then when they go out and they see the tree and discover its wonder, she becomes the most popular girl in town because she's the one who is friends with the tree. The truth is all of us are outcasts. We all feel like that. We all feel like we're different than everybody else and we want to belong. Jesus comes to us. He's one that's, he's like us but not like us. He's different than us. He's God in the flesh, that he knows what it's like to feel like we do and go through the things that we've gone through. Then he was left all alone, hanging on a tree so that we might be welcomed into his family and be at the table of his Father. Jesus is our curvy tree, see? Through the cross, Jesus invites us in. The cross is our invitation to belong to God and become his guests of honor. Jesus says there's a cost. He left his throne in heaven, his Father and his family and all of the angels, and he gave up everything, even his own life. He counted the cost, and it was worth it because you are worth it. Through him, we belong.